Hello and welcome back. In the previous video we were talking about no longer being under the law of sin and death. Now we're under the law of Christ, the law of righteousness. There was a question that came up about the Ten Commandments. So let's go over to Exodus chapter 34, verse 28. It says, "So he, Moses, was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread or drink water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments." So I used to think, well, we're under a new covenant. Through the blood of Christ, we make a covenant with God. And those other covenants, well, they're no longer relevant. And now what do I do? Because now I have found out that the Ten Commandments are also a covenant. So are they no longer relevant to me? Well, let me share something that was presented to me. And that is that I look at life through a linear perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I look at life from past, present, future in a linear perspective, then everything from the past is no longer going to be relevant to me. But I'm going to propose to you that God actually works in cycles. Now, where do I get that from? Well, let's start over in Romans, and let's go over to chapter 1, verse 20. Paul says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made." So Paul is saying we can see God by looking at his creation. So do we see cycles by looking at God's creation? Well, in Genesis chapter 1 alone, while he's creating everything, what does he say? Well, there's evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day, and the third and the fourth, fifth and sixth. And those aren't just the days. So after 7 days, does everything go away? No, we start a new week. And after 12 months, we start a new year. And if we were to be in outer space and look at the earth, it goes round and round, night and day. And the planets go around the sun, over and over. Now, I want to focus on a couple of specific examples. And the first one is, let's talk about a tree. What happens when we cut a tree? What do we see in the trunk of the tree? Well, we see rings. Now, those rings are actually telling a whole story. They actually tell us how much growth was in each year and how much water was available during those years. But is each ring independent of one another? No, each one of them is part of that tree, part of the life of that tree. Now let's go to another example, and I'm sure you've probably seen one of these, a CD. Well, when we want to play music, what does the CD have to do? Well, the CD has to turn round and round and round, and each cycle gives us a little piece of the whole song. Or songs, however many there may be in that one CD. But is each cycle separate from the other one? No, because they all tell us, they all give us the whole song or songs in that CD. But do we see that example in the Bible? Well, we already talked, one example of cycles in his creation. But what about covenants? Well, let's go over to Acts chapter 3, verse 13. It says, "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant, Jesus." So the God who was also called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Old Testament is still called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the New Testament, after Jesus died and rose again. But what happened with Abraham? Well, you probably know the story. But let's go over to Genesis chapter 17, verse 4. It says, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, Abraham, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations." So God made a covenant with Abraham and promised him that he would have descendants, many descendants. But how are Isaac and Jacob related to this? Well, if we go on further in Genesis to chapter 26, verse 1 through 4, it says, So Isaac went to Gerar. The Lord appeared to him and said, I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. And then in Genesis 35, verse 10 through 11, he says, You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you. So does God forget the promise to Abraham by reiterating it to Isaac and to Jacob? No, just because it was in the past, he doesn't forget that promise. And actually, if we go over to Exodus chapter 2, verse 24, it says, So God heard the groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had already passed away, God still remembered his promise to them. And we may say, well, he's just reiterating the promise to Isaac and to Jacob. And we're in a new covenant, the covenant through blood, the blood of Christ. Let's see what Paul has to say. Let's go over to Galatians chapter 3, verse 29. He says, And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise. So God, even though now we have the new covenant, actually it's through the new covenant, then he still remembers the covenant and the promise that he made to Abraham. Now what does Christ say? Well, let's go over to Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. It says, Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. But what does the word fulfill mean? Well, the Greek word there actually means to make full, to cause to abound. So through Jesus, through the blood that he shed, the covenant that we make with God, he's making that promise. That covenant to Abraham, he's making it abound. We are part of that promise. And it happens over and over. Every time somebody puts their trust in Christ or their faith in Christ, every time that is fulfilled and it's abounding. Because his descendants, Abraham's descendants, would be like the stars of the heavens. And so, what do we do with the Ten Commandments? Well, the Ten Commandments, a covenant, is just part of the bigger story. A story of what? Of God showing us the way, giving us instruction and direction how to return to him. Because Adam and Eve were cast out, and people can't just return to him. So he gives us a whole story of how to return to him. Now there's a reason why I brought up the example of the tree. Let's go over to Psalms chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord. And in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. And in whatever he does, he prospers. Well, who's our stream of water? Well, that's Jesus. If we draw from him, we will never be thirsty. And that's why he doesn't want us to return and to draw from the things of the world, because they never satisfy. Only the water that he provides satisfies. And see, this is all part of we still have another piece of the story. And that is that one day we will get to see him. That's the promise. That we won't just trust that he exists, but we'll actually get to see him. So we still have another part of the story yet to come. But until then, we stay connected and we continue to draw from him. So that's the end of this series. And I hope it's been an encouragement to you. I always thank you. Thank you for taking the time to watch. And I hope to see you soon.